A few months back, I decided I was pretty much over the breakup I'd had during the summer with my long-term girlfriend. It took me months to be able to get over it, as I was really heartbroken, but at some point you just sort of have to get back on the horse, don't you? So I downloaded that dating app Hinge and started swiping through profiles. It's definitely the best dating app I've come across, as it lets you actually message girls directly instead of just sort of hoping that they're going to see you and match with you. So it definitely gave me a better chance at getting to talk to the kind of girls I'm into, and one of these was a Persian girl named Sarushe. Sarushe was honestly one of the most beautiful girls I'd ever laid eyes on. She had this big mess of wild dark hair that was dip-dyed blonde towards the ends, really high cheekbones, perfectly sculptured eyebrows, and some of the deepest, darkest, most alluring brown eyes I'd ever seen. She was simply stunning, and because she'd grown up in Tehran, the capital of Iran, I had something of an edge. You see, I speak a little bit of Farsi, the language they speak there, and I figured that might impress her if I told her as much, which it did, and boom. Only an hour or so later, I sent her my opener and we were chatting. She was an extremely busy person, and I was flattered when she said that she would make time to see me. So, we arranged to meet for coffee over the weekend. She showed up to our date in her gym gear and apologized for being so underdressed, but could only make it after a scheduled workout with a personal trainer. But I didn't care at all. She looked absolutely smoking hot in her yoga pants. And we were having coffee, just kind of chatting about our lives, our interests, all that first date kind of stuff, when I look out of the big glass windows to see this dude leaning up against his car. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me at first, but after a minute or two I realized that he was just straight up staring at us. At one point, Sarushe noticed me looking over her shoulder and asked what I'm looking at, and I make a comment about the bloke outside who seemed to be proper eyeballing us. She then turns around, looking over her shoulder, then spins back with this terrified look on her face before saying something like, we have to leave, now. I'm all like, why? Do you know that fella? And she denies knowing him, but I'm not a dope. I knew what the score was, like straight away. Either it was a controlling family member or something, or it was a psycho ex-boyfriend. I figured all he'd do was follow us to try and be intimidating or something, but I never imagined he'd actually lay hands on me, and the way that he did it absolutely scared the soil out of me. You see, where I live is built up along this big mile-wide river, and the coffee shop me and Sarushe had chosen to meet at was right on the docks. So we're walking along the city's promenade when the guy cornered me, grabbed me by the throat, and started pushing me backwards so my back was leaning over the rails. I tried to get him off, but this bloke was an absolute unit, and as much as I tried, there was no getting him off of me. And the thing about the river where I live is that it's got a really, really strong current. Like if you fall off of a boat or over the side of the prom, you can be in serious trouble as the current will suck you under the water, drown you, and then just drag you out into the Irish Sea. So the whole time he's threatening me, telling me to leave Sarushe alone, all this big macho masculine stuff. Sarushe is smacking him around the head, telling him to get off me, and all the while I'm thinking, if I go over the edge here, I'm a dead man. And I don't think he had any idea of it either. Like it didn't sound like he was from our city, as we have a very particular accent, which he just didn't have. So he was probably thinking he could lash me in the water and embarrass me a wee bit, and I'd just be fine, but I'm telling you now, I wouldn't have been, and he'd have been done for manslaughter. But thank God, he didn't throw me over the railings. He just sort of backed off and headed back the way that he'd come after he'd blown off a little bit of steam. I mean, the girl was gorgeous. I don't blame him for being a bit sore after a breakup or jealous of another lad, but Jesus Christ, if he'd been angrier, if he'd have lost his cool, really lost control, I legit wouldn't be here typing this. I'd be floating in the Irish Sea somewhere, maybe washing up as a rotten corpse on the beach in County Cork, all because of some idiot getting a bit jealous. I am now a 72-year-old man. This happened long ago, but I remember it so well. The background was a series of events that placed me in a mountain cabin outside of Frederick, Maryland, circa 1969 or 1970. Just say my life at the time was in disarray. I had dropped out of college, my father had died very badly, and I was alienated. I needed to get my mind right. The opportunity to move to an isolated cabin, to live in contemplation and solitude was welcome. I had some inheritance money to pay for it. To the best of my memory, I was there 8 to 9 months. No TV, but books and radio. I had a library card, and I can't remember if I even had a phone. The story begins when, a month into my stay, a female beagle showed up at my door. She was a lost dog, and I took her in. Never could train her to do anything, but I fed her, and she was a sweet, if not the brightest, dog. A few months in, I began to feel a presence around the isolated cabin. Hard to describe, but I felt like someone was watching. On many occasions, I thought someone might even be looking into my cabin window, watching us. The next phase was the shadowing or following. I knew the folks a half-mile down the lane, woods all around, and would sometimes visit them at night. Something was waiting for me, and followed closely in the woods beside me in the darkness. You could hear it easily, footsteps in the woods, and it picked up its pace as I did. This not only happened to me, but to my younger brother who visited, and to friends, and it spooked them big time. At night, it was out there around the cabin. And here's the funny thing. I was never afraid, never felt threatened. Not at all, at least early on. There was no feeling of malevolence. I spent a good bit of time wandering the vast areas of woodlands around me. There was a state park just up the hill, and the Frederick Municipal Forest went on for mile after mile. The whole of western Maryland was much more country than it is now. None of the development had set in yet. In our hikes, the dog and we came across evidence of campsites, recent ones in the woods, traces of fires, old abandoned buildings that had corners that gave shelter and looked slept in, garbage, food and drink, paper, what have you. Perhaps hunters, but much of it did not have the organized feel that you would get from experienced hunters. The last month of my stay there was when things intensified. Maybe he sensed I was preparing to leave. In the mornings, I would find small dead animals at the bottom of the front porch steps. The cabin had a small front porch screened with a light door and 4 wooden steps to the ground. A spotlight would illuminate the long front yard with woods close by either side. Dead animals began to appear at the bottom of the steps many mornings. I remember small birds, then a squirrel, a rabbit, even a weasel one day, like they were offerings. I had to grab them up before the dog ate them, and this went on almost daily for several weeks. One night, very late, I was awoken by some sound. I lay in bed and heard something from the front porch. I hopped up and hit the lights, and I saw that hound dog who never learned to sit or stay, standing at the front door in a perfect pointer position. She was shaking in fear. She never barked. I heard the door slam and footsteps down the steps. I hit the spotlight but saw nothing. I went out. He had been on the porch at my front door, maybe trying to enter. After that, I stayed in at night more and more. The animal offerings got bigger and bigger. Larger birds, a possum, a woodchuck. It really wasn't funny. The final 2 gifts were legs, either from horses or even cows. Big and bloody. One was skinned, dear God. And the second to last day, the dog left me. I could hear her in the woods howling on a trail following a scent. I looked for her in every way I could. Came up in the following weeks, but to no avail. She left as she came. I moved back to Maryland's suburbs of D.C., got an apartment with a friend, got a job, and moved on with my life. One day, not long after, I picked up the Washington Post, and there was an article about recent encounters with the Sykesville monster. It's described as a tall, yeti-like creature, fur-covered, on 2 legs that would pick out a family or person and give them attention. I wasn't the only one. That attention, described in the article, was exactly what had happened to me, following you at night, looking inside the house, gifts, and so on. I was shocked. If I had turned on that spotlight and seen a Bigfoot or Yeti, I might still be running. But I think I know who it was. Sykesville, Maryland was the location of the Springfield Hospital Center, a large state psychiatric hospital. It was 20 miles or so east of Frederick, and back then, many folks knew how to live in the woods. They grew up that way, country folks. I think the monster was actually an escaped patient, or just a free schizophrenic who lived outside. This is like all the homeless you see in the cities now, probably off his meds, but somehow functional and just lonely. He would pick people or families to adopt, so to speak. The camps in the woods could have been him. Nothing to do, he would make mischief. I think he liked me, but sensed that I was leaving. Now, I can't prove any of this, it's just my theory. My monster was very much of that time and place, and his behavior was what I noticed in nearly every case then. I don't think he could have survived until the 1980s. Deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals threw the mentally ill out into the streets and took away the shelter of hospitals. Unprotected, the mentally ill do die. But once in a while, they find their way to you. Target was my favorite place to go shopping. I'm sad to say I don't think I can never go back there, though. Sometimes when you have such a bad experience, it will ruin the love you had for a place or a store altogether, and that's what happened to me. It all started when I graduated college. I was a psychology major and I struggled to find a job. I live in a mid-sized city and there just wasn't anything appealing to me. There weren't any jobs in my field that I could get. The only psychology job I could even find wanted 10 years of experience, so I had to take whatever job I could get. I ended up working at some funky call center, and I say funky because it really was a complete dumpster fire every single day. The managers had no idea what was going on. My coworkers were some of the weirdest people I'd ever seen. Most of them didn't have a college education either, which made me feel really bad about myself. I had some really low confidence during this time, and I felt like a failure. I still lived with my parents and had a massive amount of student debt, and I was working at a call center making minimum wage. I had also let myself go during the last few months of my senior year in college. I was really stressed out trying to pass. I just didn't have time to make salad or go for runs anymore. I was feeling really down there for a bit, and this is where James comes in. He was a really weird guy that worked at the call center too. He had a goofy-looking mustache and was a bit of a creep. I definitely saw him checking me out a few times, and I even saw him look at other girls too. A little pervy, but I couldn't expect anything less from a place like this that I worked at. Oddly enough, James was the only guy at this place that was ever nice to me. Everyone else was so miserable to be there. James had been hired a couple of weeks before I got the job there, so I guess it just didn't have enough time to make me and James completely miserable yet. There was one time when I went out for a smoke break. James joined me and started flirting with me. He definitely had his problems, but there was something about getting a little bit of attention that did kind of make me feel special. I was always a very introverted person, and I hadn't had a boyfriend in over 2 years. It felt nice to be noticed. It wasn't long before we exchanged numbers and started talking a little bit outside of work. There were a few weeks there that I kept trying to get him to shave his mustache. I told him he would look a lot better. It took about 3 weeks to finally get through to him, but when he did, I was surprised. He was actually a really handsome guy under that caterpillar, and that was when I made up my mind. If he made a move on me, I wasn't going to say no. He never made a move on me though, and I was surprised because I was sending some pretty strong signals for him to do so. He just never did. Not even over text messages or anything. All he would ever do was flirt. It wasn't very long into that situation that I gave up on him. I figured he didn't like me. I mean, honestly, what else was I supposed to think? I downloaded Tinder like everyone else. I knew my situation was bad, and I secretly fantasized about hooking up with some rich guy. I didn't find a buff millionaire, but I did find a really nice guy eventually. We went on a few dates and started going out together regularly, and I really liked him. We're still together, by the way. But this is where things got weird with James. He started acting differently. He started doing more and more inappropriate things. I was friends with James on Facebook, and when I changed my status to an in a relationship, he did one of those emoji reactions, and he put an angry face. I remember seeing it and rolling my eyes. Typical men, I thought. They don't want you until you have someone else. Now, something James would always do with me is send slightly naked pictures. It wasn't like full frontal or anything like that, but he would take racy photos of himself getting out of the shower or changing and things like that. That was okay when I was single, but he just didn't stop. And these new pics were much more revealing, if you know what I mean. And I kept telling him that I was in a relationship and he couldn't do this anymore. He just wouldn't listen. He always said that he forgot, and I knew he was doing it intentionally. Things also got really awkward at work. There were quite a few things that he would do that were just freaky. For example, pens started disappearing from my desk. I didn't think anything of it at first, just that I was being clumsy. But one day I happened to walk by James's desk and notice all of my pens. He also followed me outside every time I went on a smoke break. He always played it off like he wasn't doing anything, but it was so obvious to everyone. Well, it was around the 6-month mark of me working at that funky call center. I had my performance review and I got a raise. I got an extra $1 an hour, which I was pretty happy about. I had a few $100s in savings and decided to treat myself to my favorite store, Target. I remember making a self-congratulatory post on Facebook about it. I even mentioned that I was going to treat myself to some new sheets from Target. I remember getting comments from some of my friends and former classmates. They all congratulated me and I was really excited. Sure, I had a stupid job, but I was making the best of my situation. I remember getting to Target at about 6 or 7 on a Friday night. I went alone. I walked into the store and went over to the bedding aisle. I really wanted to pick out the best sheets for me. I am a little OCD about fabric and how things feel, so I was running my hands across the sheets to find the one that I liked the best. That was when something unexpected happened. I felt a kiss on my neck. I had been so wrapped up in feeling sheets that I didn't even notice who was behind me. I immediately thought it was my boyfriend. I mean, who else would randomly kiss me in public, right? Well, you guessed it. It was James. I turned around after he kissed me, and I was smiling. But my giddiness turned to disgust when I saw that it was him. My stomach dropped, and I wanted to scream, but I just couldn't bring myself to do anything. More of me was in shock than anything else. I know I must have looked so repulsed, but that didn't stop him from pinning me up against the aisle rack and continuing to kiss me. He shoved his entire tongue down my throat. It was honestly disgusting. This probably went on for about 3 or 4 seconds before I finally snapped out of it. I pulled my head away and slapped him across the face as hard as I could. I told him that I never wanted to see him again. I fell down onto my back and I just sat there telling him to please leave me alone. He stood there, though, looking down at me, smiling. James was a really freaky guy. He started getting on top of me and kissing me again, and that was when I finally screamed at the top of my lungs. Someone who must have been in an aisle over or two overheard and came running. It was a man who looked like he was in his 30s. He ripped James off of me and threw him against the wall. After that, James took off. The man was really nice to me. He helped me up and made sure I was okay. He asked if I wanted to call the police, and I was so shocked I just told him no in the moment. And that wouldn't be the last time that I saw James. We still work at the same call center, and my God, it's pretty awkward. I know he still creeps on my Facebook, and he looks at me all the time. I'm honestly not sure what to do about it. I haven't even told my boyfriend about what happened, and honestly, I'm kind of afraid to. But I seriously might have to, one of these days. On July 28, 1977, Travis Victor Alexander was born in Riverside, California, the son of Gary and Pamela Alexander. Travis's early years were marred by tragedy. At age 11, an unstable and ultimately toxic home life meant that Travis would be forced to go and live with his paternal grandparents. And after his father's tragic death in mid-1997, he was followed by his 7 brothers and sisters. Despite his rough upbringing, Travis performed rather well in school, attending college and eventually getting a job with a company known as Prepaid Legal Services as a salesman, and later as the company's motivational speaker, a position that paid considerably better. As part of his job at PPL, Travis would often attend conferences that took place in Las Vegas, plying his trade as a motivational speaker in front of audiences of hundreds. During one such conference in September of 2006, there was one particular woman in the audience who was enraptured by Travis's charisma and his talent for public speaking. She approached him afterwards, introducing herself and striking up a conversation that would spark off a long-term friendship. This woman's name was Jodi Arias. Jodi Ann Arias was born on July 9, 1980, in Salinas, California, to a mother of European ancestry and a father of Mexican ancestry. After she met Travis at the PPL conference, the pair grew increasingly close, which led to Jodi converting to Mormonism just 2 months later, actually being baptized by Travis himself at a ceremony that took place in Southern California. Despite the distance between them, the pair then began dating a few months later, and Jodi even took the steps to move to Mesa and then Yreka, California, living in her grandparents' place so she could be closer to Travis. Travis and Jodi had a tumultuous, on and off again relationship for almost a year and a half, often forced to maintain a long-distance relationship due to the fact that one of them lived in Arizona, while the other had to remain in California for work. This kind of distance would put a strain on any relationship, but it appeared there were other factors at work that made Jodi and Travis's relationship less than healthy. From the very first time that Travis introduced Jodi to his close friends, they seemed to take an instant dislike to her. Jodi didn't seem in the least bit keen to impress or ingratiate herself to them, seeming generally disinterested in anyone but Travis. His friends detected a kind of jealousy to her, how she seemed to act overly possessive of Travis, yet at the same time didn't seem to show him much affection either. From the get-go, they found Jodi's behavior worrying, even frightening. Shortly after Jodi moved into her grandparents' home in Yreka, she and Travis arranged to accompany one another on a week-long work-related trip to Cancun, down in Mexico. The trip was scheduled for June 15th, and the couple intended to make something of a vacation out of it. However, not long after, Travis reportedly went to company HQ to request that his travel companion be changed to another member of the sales team. There has been much speculation regarding why exactly this is, but our best guess is to assume that it involved a breakdown in his and Jodi's relationship. Then on May 28th, Jodi called Travis in a state of distress. She told him there had been a burglary at her grandparents' place where she was staying, and felt so unsafe that she begged to come and stay with him for a while. The burglars had apparently stolen a number of valuable items during the break-in, but perhaps the most significant was a .25 caliber Colt pistol which had belonged to her grandfather. Police had no luck finding the perpetrators, and eventually gave up looking altogether as they couldn't seem to find a single shred of evidence that might give them a clue to the identity of any of the people involved. In the face of Jodi begging to stay with him, Travis straight up refused. This is perhaps the best evidence we have that their pair had broken up by that point. If Travis loved her or had any feelings at all for her, surely he would have offered her a place to stay. Only he didn't. Or maybe it was the case that Travis did love her, but something else was stopping him from inviting her over. It's possible that there have been many another woman in Travis's life. However, it's also possible that Travis didn't invite Jodi over because he was afraid of her. Jodi called Travis yet again on June 2nd, repeatedly attempting to reach him between the hours of 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., but her cell phone records show that, since the longest call was a mere 17 seconds, he apparently didn't pick up the phone. Then, just after 3 in the morning, Travis called Jodi back, and the pair engaged in a lengthy conversation. We have no idea what was said during the call, but we do know that at around 5:30 that same morning, Jody drove over to a car rental place over in Redding, California, entering the business shortly after it opened at 8 a.m. She told the clerk that she wished to use the car for the long drive to Utah for a work-related trip, and then drove it to visit a few friends on her way to Utah, where she would meet up with a fellow PPL employee by the name of Ryan Burns. Yet Jody didn't show up to meet Ryan until late in the evening on June 3rd, leaving a sizable amount of time to be accounted for that day. And when she did show up in the West Jordan suburb of Salt Lake City to meet up with Ryan Burns, her colleague noticed some unusual things about her. Firstly, he saw that her normally dyed blonde hair was now brown, but not its natural shade of brown, and that she seemed to have cuts or scratches all over her hands. Jody also refused to let him near the rental car, insisting that they take his car to the PPL business conference. Naturally, Ryan thought this behavior was unusual, but the pair had more important things to think about, as the conference would keep each of them occupied for the majority of the day. Ryan had another reason to keep quiet about such unusual behavior, and that's because he and Jody had begun something of a love affair during their time in Utah, with the two spending several hours hugging and kissing on a large beanbag chair at the place that they were staying. Jody also reassured him about the cuts on her hands by telling him that she had gotten them while working part-time at a Mexican restaurant in the Wairika area, an excuse that seemed good enough for him to quiet his suspicions. Once their business was adjourned, Jody departed from Salt Lake City on June the 6th, driving back westward towards California. Her cell phone records showed that she attempted to call Travis several times, leaving a handful of voicemails, yet she apparently also found a way to access this voicemail system. Why exactly she chose to do so is still a matter of conjecture, but we can all agree that it constitutes some rather unusual behavior. When she returned the rental car to the outlet in Redding, the clerk began to inspect the interior as a matter of routine. It is then that he too noticed something unusual. The vehicle was missing its floor mats on the driver and passenger side. There were also some kind of stains on the upholstery, as if some thick liquid had been spilled and then left to dry. However, since the upholstery was black and the color of said liquid was not visible, no suspicions were raised among the staff at the car rental outlet, and the interior was clean before it could be inspected by anyone of any importance. Meanwhile, a few days prior, Travis's employers had tried to contact him for a conference call, only to have their calls unanswered. The same pattern repeated itself for a few days, with friends and colleagues calling only for Travis to not pick up his phone. By June 9th, as a handful of Travis's friends were beginning to worry amongst themselves regarding his well-being, they agreed to go over to his home to check up on him. They spoke to a few of the other tenants who lived in the same building as Travis did, and found that they had not seen him in a few days. But since he traveled for work frequently, they didn't seem to think that there was anything to worry about. However, one of Travis's neighbors was in possession of a spare key to his apartment, which Travis has entrusted them with on the off chance he should ever lose his keys. The concerned group of friends proceeded to unlock the door to Travis's apartment, calling out his name as they entered. Then one of them froze with a sharp gasp, pointing to a pool of congealed blood that sat in the hallway in Travis's bedroom. In a panic, they began to search the apartment for him, eventually being greeted by the sight of his days-old corpse, which was lying in the bathtub, covered in blood. His friends cried and screamed as they called 911, but they did not attempt to revive him, as it was obvious from the state of his dead body that he had been deceased for a while. During the 911 call that followed the discovery, a police dispatcher asked if Travis had potentially thought about ending his own life, or if his friends knew of anyone who may have been threatening his life. His friends immediately mentioned Jody Arias, his ex-girlfriend, as a possible suspect in his murder. He said that, in the days prior to his death, Travis had mentioned that Jody had been stalking him, accusing him of seeing someone else, and seemed to be in some kind of jealous rage. This psychopathic jealousy had led her to begin attempting to access his Facebook account, and even going so far as slashing his car's tires. When investigating police arrived at Travis's home, they commenced an intense search for any evidence or clues as to the identity of his killer. One of the most curious things they discovered was a recently purchased digital camera in the washing machine. Despite a large amount of water damage, police were able to recover the camera's memory card and found on it a number of photographs which someone had apparently attempted to delete. These photographs showed Travis and Jody in numerous suggestive poses taken on the afternoon of June 4th. The final photograph in the series was taken at 5:39 p.m. that same day and showed Travis alive and well while he was taking a shower. In it, he was smiling playfully, completely naked, a candid depiction of the man's final moments. As another photograph, taken just minutes later, showed Travis bleeding profusely while lying on the bathroom floor. DNA samples were taken from bloody handprints found in the bathroom, which gave police all the evidence they needed to arrest a suspect, as they contained not only Travis's DNA, but Jodi Arias's too. After being indicted for first-degree murder by a grand jury in Maricopa County, Jodi was arrested at her home in California and then extradited to Arizona on September 5, 2008. Less than a week later, she pled not guilty, giving several different accounts of her alleged involvement in Travis's death. At first, she told investigating police officers that she was nowhere near Arizona on the day her ex-boyfriend was murdered. Then, after pressure from the cops, she admitted she was present at the time of his death, but that it had involved a home invasion, whereby two individuals broke into Travis's residence before killing him and attacking her in turn. 2 years of investigation later, Jodi then changed her story entirely, telling the police that she had indeed killed Travis, but had only done so in self-defense. She spun a tale of brutal domestic violence, how she was a victim of a cruel and violent man, and how she regularly feared for her life around him. At her trial in February of 2013, Jodi told the jury that she had been physically and emotionally abused by her parents, and that her life with Travis had echoed that same cycle of abuse and guardianship, one that she wanted to escape from, but couldn't quite bring herself to. She went on to describe the abusive type of life that Travis subjected her to, one that included a great deal of BDSM and other painful acts, most of which were in direct violation of the Mormon rules regarding such things. Jodi also had recorded a phone conversation that she had with Travis, one that she used as evidence that proved that at one point Travis had wanted to use zip ties to tie her to a tree while she was dressed as Little Red Riding Hood. Jodi is heard to respond enthusiastically on the phone, but told the court it was all an act, that the idea terrified her, and was typical of the kinds of things that Travis wanted to do. Jodi also mentioned that Travis had admitted to find underage children attractive, basically painting him to be a complete monster. However, the prosecution argued that Jodi was a vengeful, vindictive person who had only recorded the phone conversation in an attempt to blackmail Travis and embarrass him in front of his Mormon peers. The prosecution also questioned a forensic expert before the jury, prompting them to say that there had been a thorough examination of Travis's computer, one in which absolutely had no evidence of child pictures found, nor were there any references to anything intimate with children. Rebuttal witnesses from the prosecution also included several of Travis's other girlfriends, who stated he never exhibited any problems with anger or violence. Clinical psychologist Janine DeMarthe testified for the prosecution, stating that she found no evidence that Travis had ever abused Jodi. DeMarthe also said that Jodi suffered from borderline personality disorder, showing signs of immaturity and an unstable sense of identity. The final nail in Jodi's legal coffin was the prosecution telling the jury that a single .25 caliber bullet casing was found near Travis's body, the same caliber of the gun that was stolen from her grandparents' place just a week before the murder. As it turns out, Jodi had faked the entire burglary just to obtain the murder weapon, which not only showed that she was a dangerous psychopath, willing to hurt those close to her to achieve her goals, but that she had actually been planning to kill Travis for quite some time. After the trial, that had reportedly cost the U.S. taxpayer over $3 million, the jury found Jodi guilty of first-degree murder, and she only narrowly avoided the death penalty when a judge essentially took pity on her mental illness, sentencing her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She was also ordered to pay Travis's siblings over $30,000 in damages. As of 2016, Jodi is housed at Arizona State Prison Complex, Perryville, and her case and trial have been the subject of a great deal of social media interest, with even Donald Trump commenting on what he called her obvious guilt. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the whole sordid drama is that Travis may well have genuinely believed that he had found the love of his life, and how in searching for the fairy tale romance that all people want deep down, he found the polar opposite, a living nightmare that would end in him losing his life to someone who could fairly be described as a conniving, violent, psychopathic predator. Relationships break down all the time, for a variety of reasons. People hurt, people cry, but most ultimately move on and find someone else. Jodi took that chance away from Travis in a horridly callous and bloody manner. Instead of letting Travis go, she dragged him down like a sinking ship, one which neither of them will ever emerge from intact.